talk this morning about the interconnections of race, class, and gender, as that grounded the development of my own feminist theology and that of a cohort of feminist theologians, such as Letty Russell and Bev Harrison, whose thought was shaped by similar contexts in the 1960s, namely the civil rights, anti-war, and New Left movements. I want to focus on this theme because I think it has been somewhat misinterpreted or forgotten by feminists in the academy and theological schools who began their work in the 80s and 90s, or, of course, in the 21st century. Now, the general storyline that I find among my students in feminist theology and theological schools today, reinforced by a number of articles and books, is that feminist theology began in some indeterminate period, but the assumption was that this was somehow the late 60s. It began with white feminists, sometimes sort of one word, white feminists, white feminists who were oblivious to class and race difference among women. It was these bad white feminists who had no sense of class and race, were then critiqued by a growing diversity of women in theological schools from many different racial and cultural contexts for their false universalism and brought to task for their foolish belief that women's experience was some kind of generic universal. And, of course, now we know better. Now, I have no doubt at all that this was the way in which a lot of feminism was, in fact, experienced in theological schools. As African American and sort of Ada Maria and Hispanic women and so on began to get into theological schools in the 80s, and feminist theology had gained something of a foothold in universities and theological schools. What I want to point out is that this storyline deeply violates and, in fact, erases my own experience and that of a cohort of feminist theologians who began their work in the late 60s. Now, perhaps it's important to point out here that there was not one, but at least two, rather different contexts in which feminism, the feminist movement, arose in the mid to late 60s. And one was the movement of women lawyers and government workers, writers, out of which the National Organization of Women arose, featured, as you see, on as the icon of the conference. And this movement, I think, was open to class, not particularly sensitive to race. And at least some leaders, Betty Friedan in particular, was threatened by the lesbian movement. She went conspiratorially around speaking of the Lavender Menace, if you remember. And there was a second movement, which arose from the civil rights and anti-war and New Left movements, Black Power movement, and this was the context in which my own feminist perspective emerged. Now, the scenario of white feminists oblivious to race, class, and global context undoubtedly, as I said, reflected realities in the 60s. And I wonder whether this had perhaps become more so in the mid and late 70s as feminism became an established discourse. in the academy. But my own experience was almost the opposite of this scenario. In the 60s, I became immersed in the civil rights movement. In 1965, along with a whole group of students and chaplains at the Claremont colleges in Claremont, California, I went to spend the summer as a volunteer with the Delta Ministry in Mississippi. Now, this was a scary decision because the previous summer, which was called the Mississippi Summer, 3 young civil rights workers had been killed, and their bodies had been hidden by local whites. So we went to Mississippi with some conscious awareness that we were risking our lives. And I remember as we crossed the state line into Mississippi in our battered car, which we drove from California, thinking that I might die, and deciding that I had to be willing to face that risk. Now, let me be clear, I have no tendencies toward martyrdom, and I was the mother of 3 young children, so I was not seeking death. But I think there are moments in your life when you come face to face with death, and the possibility that if you cross a certain line, someone could kill you. And that was that kind of defining moment for me when one had to decide, are you going to be governed by fear, or are you going to go ahead? Now, for me, the 1965 summer in Mississippi was a critical turning point in my life. For the first time, I experienced what white America looks like from the context of blacks, specifically in this framework in the South, in Mississippi. And I came to recognize whites as very scary and threatening people. People who would kill my black colleagues at the drop of a hat and would kill me, possibly, for taking their side. Now, our group of volunteers was based at a black college, or a former black college, in Beulah, Mississippi. We had all these programs that were based at that college, or former college. And I decided to volunteer with the Head Start program. I traveled around rural Mississippi with another colleague, an African-American woman from Brooklyn, visiting Head Start programs in rural churches. Now, shortly before we had arrived, a group of whites had in fact driven through our college and sprayed gunfire at the windows of all of the dormitories. They just drove through spraying bullets at the windows. And so we mounted a night watch. Each of us would take our turn, staying up all night, a couple of us together, to guard the community from another such invasion. We had a very formidable defense. If such whites did drive through, we would ring a bell. And everybody was supposed to dive under their bed. You know, this was, well, it's better than being in your bed and have a bullet come through the window. So we were to, that was our work was to nightly watch for such an invasion and warn people to duck under their bed. Now, during my travels through Mississippi with my colleague, she and I decided to go over to Bogalusa, Louisiana, for a couple of days. Do any of you remember Bogalusa? What was happening in Bogalusa, Mississippi in 1965? It was basically a town that was being besieged by the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a group of young blacks of the town that were, again, mounting a night watch. They called themselves the Deacons for Defense. And so they were watching nightly for this, and the Ku Klux Klan were literally surrounding the town. So we spent a couple of days with that community. And here I had an even more dramatic taste of what it meant to be black in America, literally living under siege by whites. Now, when I returned from Mississippi, went back to California, another African-American friend of mine, Minette Lal, who had been in Mississippi also, she and I decided to become volunteers in Watts, a black neighborhood in Los Angeles, which had gone up in flames that summer. And we worked with militant black and white clergy who trained us in the proper way of working in the black community, as well as nonviolent methods of resistance in marches and sit-ins.
We can hear you.
Okay, so I'll just...
Wants to.
Okay, I messed it up here. I pushed this little button. Okay, so after that period of being in Mississippi and then in Watts, my family and I moved to Washington, D.C., where for the next 10 years I taught at the Howard University School of Religion, a historical black university. Our family committed itself to live in a black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and we added work against the war in Vietnam to our work against racism. I think my children grew up thinking that what you do when you go in downtown Washington is picket the White House. You know, this was... Now, during this period, I became steeped in the critique of racism, class hierarchy, and American neocolonial intervention. That was the whole discourse of our, shall we say, our community. So it was not race, class, or global awareness that were missing. What was missing was gender. Gender analysis was not welcome in the circles that had moved me to critical consciousness in the 1960s and early 70s. My mentors in the civil rights and anti-war movements were white and black leftist males, most of them clergy, black theology, liberation, third world liberation theologies, these were being founded at that time. And so I drank in a critique of American classist, racist, and militarist society. Among my first books was a collection of essays that I had written between 1968 and 71 called Liberation Theology: Human Hope Confronts Christian History and American Power. It's published in 72. The book contains essays on black theology, Jewish-Christian relations, Christian anti-Semitism, communitarian socialism, the white left in America, Latin American liberation theology, along with two early essays on feminist theology and on ecology. My essay on black theology was based on the early work of Jim Cone, and my essay on Latin American liberation theology cites the book of Gustavo Gutierrez, at that point not yet translated into English. Now, my working assumptions in these essays, as in all of my subsequent work, is that liberation theology is multidimensional. We need to look at it from a diversity of context, a wide range of contexts. And it was in the late 60s that I began to add the questions of gender to what was then, in the circles in which I moved, the established race, class, and anti-colonial discourse. In 1968, I wrote and gave my first major essay on sexism, which was titled Male Chauvinist Theology and the Anger of Women. I thought it was kind of sprightly title. I mean, what I found was the word anger absolutely terrified the white community. I mean, I was, living in the world of black power. Anger rhetoric was just kind of normal. So I was kind of surprised by how galvanized and, frightened, shall we say, white men were by the term anger of women. However, at the Howard School of Religion, where I taught from 1965 to 76, there was little openness to black theology, not to mention feminism. I mean, feminism wasn't even on the map. The faculty was mostly older African Americans who had struggled in the 40s and 50s to establish middle-class respectability. And they preferred to be called Negroes, capital N, and shuddered at the word black, which they saw as close to a racist insult. I was the first faculty member to introduce the writings of Jim Cone at the seminary, although one of my colleagues, Dr. Deotis Roberts, would begin to develop a black theology that was consciously more conservative and more, quote, reconciling than that of Cone. My early article on black theology, which I mentioned above, was an effort to respond to this critique coming from my colleagues and to defend Cone's views, rooted in what I saw as a positive reading of black power. Now, gender was not mentioned in this article. Teaching at a historic black seminary, gender was a very touchy subject coming from a white woman, but also from black women. There were few younger black women at the seminary when I first came. Women students were mainly older black women who were in a secondary degree program offered to urban women pastors who did not have a college degree. So I began to develop my first systematic and historical work in feminist theology in a leave of absence in which I taught at Harvard Divinity School. I jokingly, when I was up here, referred to Harvard as the White Howard of America. Because you see, Howard always called itself the Black Harvard. So I said, well, here at the White Howard of America. By the way, I have to tell you another little story about that year. I was invited, as Ann Browdy mentioned yesterday, to be the Stillman Professor. Harvey Cox was kind of handing out the Stillman Professor year by year in those days, because at that point they were still kind of nervous at having Catholics who might be here for more than 1 year at a time. But a certain other German professor decided that I was insufficiently eminent to hold the Stillman Professor, so I should be paid by it but not hold the title. So I went about gleefully saying that I was under the Stillman chair but not on it. I taught an absolutely wonderful group of students, and you've heard some of those names already: Linda Barafaldi, Emily Culpepper, a terrific group of women. I had taught one course where I tried to trace the rise of patriarchy, patriarchal religions in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, and the shaping of early Christianity. And then another on the 19th century European misogynist anthropologies, and the beginnings of feminism. Those were my two courses. But I also taught a course on Christian anti-Judaism, looking particularly at its patristic roots. And these lectures became the book Faith and Fratricide, The Christian Roots of Anti-Semitism, published in '74. Now, I have to say that the feminists at Harvard Divinity School seemed a bit puzzled by why I would be teaching this course. Anti-Judaism in Christianity was not seen as a topic of feminism in those days. From my perspective, all the structures of discrimination, race and class as well as gender, but also religious discrimination, Christian religious imperialism, that all of these were part of the critique of feminism. Now, my work on feminist theology was then developed in a second year after the year I was at Harvard, in a series of lectures at Yale Divinity School. And thereafter, I taught this material several times at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington. I did not try to teach a course in feminist theology at Howard. In one course on contemporary ethical issues, I introduced one lecture on gender, and I asked a black male clergy friend to lead this lecture. He was, in fact, extremely good at this because he could really talk about the sexism of black males to black males. I could not do that. And it was really evident to me that the topic of sexism in the black community was very volatile, and I, as a white woman, was not going to be able to address that. My students at Howard were almost all black men, not only African Americans, but Caribbeans, Africans. It was actually a very global community, but predominantly black. But there was no available black women to discuss gender issues in terms of theology at Howard at that time. And if there had been, they would have had a hard time being heard. And of course, I realized this in asking a black male cleric to speak on sexism. At that point, critical perspectives on gender relations could hope to get a hearing from black males only from another black male. And in fact, the students listened with very skeptical expressions, even to him. But he was a black male cleric, and so they accorded him some respect. Now, toward the second half of my period there in the early 70s, some younger black women were beginning to enter Howard, women who had graduated from college and were going into the MDiv, so a new generation was entering of younger black women, and they began to express an interest in gender issues. And in 1975, a latent tension over this issue exploded. A young black woman student did her master's thesis on gender critique of theology in the black church. Our faculty was a small one, there was only 8, and it was customary to review the master's theses as a total faculty. This young woman was roundly ridiculed by the acting dean of the faculty, and the other faculty sort of passively backed him up. I intervened to defend her, and the hostility was turned onto me. The acting dean called me into his office and threatened to fire me. In his view, my defense of this young woman student had insulted the faculty, namely himself. At that time, I had no tenure. I taught there 10 years without a single sabbatical. I had no tenure, and so I was vulnerable to dismissal. However, this attack did not worry me very much, because I was privy to two pieces of information that he did not know, namely that I was on the search committee to bring in a new dean. And we decided to bring Dr. Lawrence Jones from Union Theological Seminary to become the dean of Howard. So I knew that things were going to change at Howard when he came. A new generation of black scholars identified with the black theological perspective were going to be asked to teach. Secondly, a school near Chicago, Garrett Theological Seminary, had invited me to come and become the Georgia Harkness Professor of Applied Theology. And there, feminist theology would in fact be defined as central to my work. Now, Garrett had already made a strong commitment to a large number of black students and faculty and the doing of theological education in the context of what Garrett called the church and the black experience. Jim Cohn had done his MDiv at Garrett and his PhD at Garrett Northwestern. In the 50s and 60s, he had been deeply critical of Garrett's lack of attention to race issues. But Garrett at least had tried to heed his call in the 70s and attempted to make the black perspective a major commitment to theological education, as it remains to this day. Okay, I have about one more minute. So the president was also very sensitive to the fact that feminism should come in a way that really was in dialogue with race issues, and that was clearly why they were interested in me, since I had been there at Howard for 10 years. But I had also become convinced that it was time to leave Howard. Precisely as a white woman, I could not initiate the dialogue about gender, and I knew that Lawrence Jones would bring in some not only younger black scholars, but younger black women scholars, as indeed they have. I mean, we have wonderful people like Kelly Brown Douglas. She, by the way, would have been a nice person here to be coming. Now, since that time, of course, a whole new reality has exploded. Many, much greater diversity in theological education, African American women, Hispanic women, and increasingly from a diversity of religious perspectives have come in, and all of that is, to me, absolutely essential. In other words, I think that feminist theology has to be done in every context. If we really believe that race, class, religion, all of these diversities exist, that in each of these places where these different contexts connect, there needs to be a diversity of voices really expressing that. So I have always been really delighted at the increasing diversity of perspectives, and feel that even though, you know, in the 60s we had a discourse about that, what we obviously didn't have was the colleagues in the Hispanic community, the black community, Asian, American Indian, increasingly from Jewish and Muslim perspectives. A casual glance around this assembly would make clear. But we also really need to listen respectfully to our very particular stories. Thank you.